Welcome back to the City Current Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. We're always honored to bring you inspiring stories of individuals and organizations making a difference and powering the good. And we love talking about creativity. And so we get to highlight some books, some photography, and so much more. We're honored to have with us our good friend, Bruce Meisterman. He's a writer, an author, a photographer. We have books in hand that we get to highlight, all sorts of good stuff. But Bruce, how are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing fine, Jeremy. Yourself?
Doing well. So we've known you for a long time and always in the creative space when you talk about working together and your legacy here in the Mid-South and beyond. But let's get a little backstory when you talk about stepping into photography and writing, and you've got fiction and nonfiction, everything in between. But give us a little bit, when you start talking about kind of how you got into this space, give us a little bit of your background.
As a kid, I was always drawing and doing things like that. And when I went to college, I thought I wanted to be a painter, which was a very lofty aspiration and one misplaced. I was a terrible painter. Nothing exists any longer that I created. In doing so, I still had the creative burning inside. So I got work with a photographer in New York City and said, yeah, I like this, and got into that and found, for better, for worse, that's where I could use my creativity, and did that for a number of years. Like a lot of photographers, we want to have a book of our work, or if not multiple books. And I embarked on a journey that led to Narn, which was a photographic document of disappearing rural Newfoundland. And that came out in 2012. Been thrilled with it. And I started work on another book, another photographic book, when I had an idea for a story, which I wanted to give to a writer. And my wife said, no, you have to write it. And I'm like, I've never written fiction. You're nuts. And she was insistent. So I embarked on writing.
When you look at telling the stories, talk about where you draw the inspiration, because I think in that instant, which I love the fact that your wife was like, no, you need to tell this story. But it's a very clever story when you talk about the power of light and how that impacts others, and then manipulation, and then there's a lot to that story. And so when you step in as a writer to undertake transitioning from telling it through a lens of photography to now on paper and pulling out what's in your head, talk about that transition.
I think being a photographer is what led me to just the recognition of light in all its forms. In the course of a day, light changes, and you can see it all around you. And I was sitting on Poplar Avenue in traffic. What a surprise, right? It's what one does in Memphis. I'm just sitting there, and I'm looking at a car next to me and the reflections in a hubcap. And I'm like, gee, I wonder if all reflections disappeared. And that sort of grew. And I said, okay, if that were to happen, what would have created it? And then I said, and then it just grew, and all light disappeared. And then getting into the book, it just expanded beyond that. I had no idea where it was going to go. There's essentially two types of writers: a plotter, P-L-O-T-T-E-R, and a pantser. A plotter is the one who has all the cards on the board. He knows he or she knows exactly where it's going. And a pantser is one who does it by the seat of the pants. Guilty.
But that is this book right here, The Light Inerrant. And so give us, so obviously this is the book we're talking about, but give us a little bit of a synopsis when you talk about how you kind of, tease this book, and really obviously then too where we can get the book.
Yeah, sitting down, I came up with all sorts of scenarios that I thought the story would go through, and none of them did. It just found its own way. A long time ago, a friend of mine asked me where I get my creativity or my inspiration. And we came to the conclusion that most creative people are just vessels. Wherever the ideas come from, they're deposited in there for better, for worse. And we run with it. So that's what I did. The story started out that the light disappeared. And I said, okay, how am I going to couch that in terms that will hopefully be interesting to a reader? And I think with any writer, our biases or our predilections show through in certain ways, good and bad. And I was off and running.
And when you think about light disappearing, I mean, just imagine if literally the sun, everything is now black. And so then what does that create in a world? And so how that plays out, I think, is really interesting. And obviously that goes back to, like you said, your use of light as a photographer, and then how that plays out in a whole new realm as a story.
Yeah.
And so carry that into then A Coward's Guide to Living, because this will lead us into the next project you're working on. But talk about A Coward's Guide to Living.
Well, interestingly enough, The Light Inerrant, which was my second fiction book, was the one my wife insisted I write. And I did, and wasn't going anywhere with it. And then I just really came up with a title for a book. Again, had no idea where it was going to go. And it was called My 11 Suicides, which a lot of people said, great title, don't use it. It's too depressing. So that morphed into 11 Little Deaths, which sounded more like an Agatha Christie story, which it wasn't. And then that came to A Coward's Guide to Living when I thought about the story itself. And that was the first published fiction book. That has certain biographical incidents in it that I've experienced. Did not inform the story, but certainly embellished it. It was a person who was confronted with a meaningful death for the first time in his life. His best friend had died and left him 2 letters, one to be opened upon his death, another one to be opened after he committed the 11 little suicides, little deaths to ourselves, those things that hold us back from growing, whether they're prejudices or just inertia about things. And again, that found its way into a different thing. Initially, I thought it was going to be a professor investigating historical suicides. That didn't happen. The funeral took off and went from there. And it had him embarking on a journey of self-discovery.
What's interesting is you bring up, like you said before, being a vessel, right? And you don't really know where the story is going to go. Much like a songwriter, sometimes you hear, these hit songs are written in 5 to 15 minutes because inspiration hits, you're in the moment and you just create. And I think in many cases, I think it is refreshing because just like you're talking about, for those who are creative that says, I have an idea, but it's not really thought out. I don't know where to begin. And to your point, just begin and let things happen and evolve. And just because you don't know ultimately where it's going to go doesn't mean that it's not going to create something beautiful in the process, and you're going to grow in the process as well. Do you walk into any of these, and this will lead us into the one you're working on next is, kind of the second act of this, but do you walk in with any idea though of what you want the reader to pull away? So in other words, are there certain principles? Are there certain, things that you're saying, hey, these are the lessons that I want readers to take out. I'm not sure how it's going to play out, but I want them to take these away ultimately. Or do you let those just kind of play out organically as well?
I would love to take credit that everything is predetermined. But I can't. That would be a falsehood. It's, as I said earlier, pantser, and just letting it evolve. I don't have an end story or an ending to the story in mind. It just goes where it wants to go. There's 2 books that I'm writing right now that are, I know how one is sort of going to end. But that's because it's already 85% written, and I'll get to that one in a little bit. But technology enabled me to finish this book, and I don't mean using technology, but it gave me the solution in writing for the story. No, it's I follow it, and talking with other writers over the years, when you sit down and write, your characters are in charge of you. I have tried to write a character. I want this character to do this. And they refuse. It's just not right. And they go where they want to go. And that will inform the story a lot. the book I'm actively writing right now is I wanted a character to do something, and she said, "No, I'm leaving," and she did.
How do those characters, how does writing, how does that change then you and your perspective of everyday life? So I've got to believe that as you're sitting there creating and you've got all these different characters that are really forming their own opinions and doing things their own way, like how does that then really craft and recreate your view of the world?
That's a great question, because I think it's my creativity that gives me the opportunity to learn from creating things. A long time, oh God, over 30 years ago, I was in Romania photographing. Very poor village. It was probably about a year and a half after Ceausescu had been hung. And I'm walking in this village of about 1,000 people, and they have running water every third day. Electricity is spotty. And I'm walking down this dirt road, which all the streets are dirt. And I noticed this garden in the midst of this. And I came to the realization that people don't plant flowers in gardens unless there's some degree of hope. That they're looking for a future. And that was a realization. And the camera allowed me to do that and looking at that. Writing is the same way. It's again, as a vessel, I have no idea what's going to pour out. I get there and all of a sudden I'm going, that's interesting. I didn't realize that or understand it. So that's what it's been. It's as much for me to learn about myself and the world as it is hopefully to entertain the reader.
I love the vantage point too. As a photographer, you're taking it at face value, right? Like you're immersed in a world and you're capturing stories and lessons in the process, but you're using the real world as your tapestry, right? And it's kind of the same thing with the book, is you're stepping into a world and you're allowing that world to unfold, but you're kind of taking a snapshot of that world. And even though that world might not be the physical world, it might be, more in your mind, you're sharing that along with the characters who are in that world. And so I think that's kind of a cool vantage point of just how you're, describing it. What for other writers, share how you like to create. So wake up early, stay up late. Is there any, method, process? What's your process, if there is one, for writing?
I would love to say that there's a predetermined way. It isn't. When I was writing both books, I really wrote them on my lunch hour, which sometimes went a bit longer, and weekends, sometimes evenings. But now, that this is all I'm doing, is pretty much as the muse hits me. I'd gone probably about recently 5 weeks where I hadn't written anything. And part of that was I had some surgery on my hand, which didn't really prevent me from writing. But my head wasn't there. Now that I'm through the recovery and all that, I'm writing again. I tend to write early afternoon, which I have no idea why. I get up very early in the morning. I'm not predisposed to writing, although I could, but it seems that midday is when I'm ready to do it. And I usually have a daily goal of how many words or pages I want to crank out.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the key, is you do have some set goals and you wait for when the muse, strikes. You are working on a follow-up to A Coward's Guide to Living. Talk a little about that second piece of the storyline there.
And The Light Inerrant as well. That's the two books. A Coward's Guide, when I first wrote it, and for some time I went, it's a standalone, that's it. And then again, as I said, ideas pour into your head, and I realized there's more to the story. A Coward's Guide does not have, it doesn't have a bad ending or a sad ending or anything like that, but it's a little bittersweet. And I started to think, okay, fine. Some years later, what would happen to the protagonist? And then a crazy idea hit me, and I went, oh my God, I have to do this. And that's the first chapter of the book, which I've shared with a friend of mine, and he just said, oh, that's really intense. He said, "That's not like the other book." I said, "The rest of it will be."
That's a good teaser. So where do we go to purchase the books? How do we start to follow and carry this conversation forward? So where do we go to get all the books and even the photography? Keep us in the loop on everything going on in your world.
Calvert's Guide and The Light Inerrant are both available at Novel in Memphis and on Amazon. You can get them there. Narn, the photographic book, Novel has, I think, the one remaining copy. I have a few that I might be convinced to part with, but they're very few now.
That's a good thing. It means scarcity builds demand, right? So talk about website, and for you personally, for those who say, hey, I want to start following your efforts, where can we go to follow you personally?
The website is bmeisterman.com, just like it sounds. Yeah, and I post on that periodically. It's usually up to date. It needs an updating right now. I do post occasionally on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram when there's something happening with the books. If I'm giving a talk anywhere, that'll be on all those platforms.
Well, it makes it easy. Definitely appreciate everything you're doing. It's always fun having you come on talking about the work you're doing. So Bruce, always good to see you, buddy. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate it.